equity, and the best jobs of the future. So this event today is one of more than 100 going on during National Digital Inclusion Week all around the country to talk about the important issues faced around digital skills and all of the implications for society. And obviously, that's a very different conversation now than it would have been 2 years ago. And the other thing that's interesting about this topic is I think for too many years and for too many people, the subject of lack of internet access was probably experienced by watching South Park episodes and laughing, right? I mean, this is an issue that's deadly serious now, as we all know, and it impacts everybody's lives on a daily basis, but I think for a long time didn't get the attention it deserves. So we're happy to talk about this issue today and its implications for society and for policymakers, especially on the eve of potential action around bipartisan infrastructure reform and additional investments at the federal level. So before we get started, let me recognize our co-sponsors, the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, EDC, the National Society of Black Engineers, the Society of Women Engineers, Qualcomm, and AnitaB.org. So with that, let me recognize our first speaker, Porsha Wu, Managing Director, U.S. Policy for Microsoft. Porsha, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, James, and thanks to the STEM Ed Coalition. Thanks to all the sponsors. It's really exciting to be here this week. When we talk about the importance of digital inclusion, I also want to recognize my fellow panelists with the National Skills Coalition, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and the Joint Center. It's been so exciting to partner with all of you on some of this work this year. So, as we're talking about digital equity this week, really drilling down and thinking, what does that mean? What does it really mean to make sure that individuals and communities can really fully participate in our economy? And post-COVID, it's obvious that that digital inclusion is a key part of that. Part of that is broadband. According to FCC data, 15 million Americans don't have access. Looking at our own data at Microsoft, we see that there are over probably 100 million Americans who aren't accessing high internet at broadband speeds. Maybe as many as 20 million of those are school children around the country. So, there's a huge gap there. Yet at the same time, we know of the jobs out there, of the 9 million job openings, roughly 75% of those require digital skills. And so this sort of big disconnect is something we're really worried about. And the question is, how do we get from where we are to where we need to be to have a more inclusive economy and inclusive growth? So I wanted to talk for a second, and I'm about to hopefully exercise my own digital skills here, and demonstrate a scorecard that Microsoft worked on with the Digital Inclusion Alliance and with the National Skills Coalition. And it's really the State Digital Equity Scorecard. The idea being, we all know we have a lot to do on increasing and improving digital equity. But one of the problems is, how do we know how well states are doing? What are some best practices? How do we provide tools for states to figure out where they are on their journey and how they can improve? So I'm now going to, I hope, share this screen. I hope that worked. Did it work? Okay, good.
Yes.
All right, so here we are. Welcome to the Digital Scorecard. So just so everybody knows, this is a site online. The address is at the top. The idea is you can go through and look at the different states in the United States and how they're performing on these different indicators. So how are they doing on collecting data? That's a huge part of the problem. We don't always know what the needs are and where they are. How about a plan? How do you address online digital skills, which are so critical? It's great to have access to broadband or hopefully even an affordable device, but do people have the skills to use them? What else do we have in terms of helping people apply those skills in terms of workforce training? So incumbent worker training funds, technology apprenticeships, and then how does that tie into state broadband? So I want to leave, I know our other panelists are going to talk in more detail about what this means, but I want to encourage everyone to use this as a tool, and you can see sort of under each of the indicators, you can get a sense of how a state is doing, drill down and look at what some examples of best practices are and how we can use these different tools and learn from each other as we're on this important journey. Thanks. Let me pause there, James. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Porsha. So next up, we have Katie Spicher, Managing Director of Government Affairs at the National Skills Coalition. Katie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, James. So National Skills Coalition fights for a national commitment to inclusive, high-quality skills training for jobs that are at the backbone of our economy. The goal of this effort is so that more people have access to a better life and more businesses see sustained growth. And one of the biggest things that we're hearing from our partners across the country and from the businesses with whom we work is this challenge around digital skills. I'll outline 3 things that we know right now about digital skills. So the first is when we talk about the digital divide that includes this gulf between people who have access to computers and devices and those who don't, those who lack access to the internet. It also includes those that don't have access to digital skills. And this challenge has been intensified even more during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second thing I'll discuss a little bit more is that businesses across industries need workers to have access to digital skills, both new workers that are coming into those industries, as well as the existing workers that already work in industries across our economy. And third, unsurprisingly, due to the effects of structural racism, workers of color are overrepresented among those workers who haven't had access to adequate digital skills. So on that first point, when we talk about the digital divide, where does digital skills fit into that? When people think about the digital divide, the images that come to mind may be people who don't have computers or internet, and that's part of it. It's also people who don't have the digital skills in order to use computers or the internet. And when we talk about access to digital skills, we really mean 3 things. So first is access to foundational digital training that arms people with the knowledge to use current technology and respond to technological changes. The second thing is access to occupational specific skills that help people adapt and advance in their careers and industry. And the third is access to reskilling, training that helps people move from one industry to another in response to structural shifts in the labor market, like those that we've seen from the current pandemic. Before the pandemic struck, this was obviously an issue. And one of the things that we've heard from our businesses is that technology has adapted 10 years in 10 months. And so the digital skills challenge for workers both on the job and those who've lost their job has become even more of a crisis. And we've seen this in a few ways that are really resonant with some of the challenges around the crisis. So frontline workers across industries from agricultural, construction, healthcare, retail, manufacturing, and hospitality really had to adopt to new technologies overnight. One example that we talk about a lot is, so paramedics had to triage patients with telehealth technology. Retail workers needed to use customized apps in order to process inventory. Restaurant workers had to transition to online ordering and delivery technologies. And workers across industries really had to use virtual and online platforms in order to stay safe during the crisis. At the same time, and I know we'll get into some of this later though, we don't have a comprehensive policy to address the needs of either the workers who are in these industries or the businesses that are working to hire them. So as we think through that, there's almost 1 in 3 workers have limited or no digital skills. That means that 13% of workers have no skills, 18% have limited digital skills. And what do we mean by that? So people who don't have any digital skills weren't able to meet 3 baseline criteria in the assessment. So the first is that they didn't have any prior computer use, or they weren't willing to take the computer-based assessment. Or they didn't have the ability to complete 4 out of 6 really basic computer tasks, like using a mouse or highlighting text on screen. For people with limited skills, that means that they could only complete really simple digital tasks with a generic interface and just took a couple of steps. For example, people at this level might have a difficult time sorting email responses into pre-existing folders to keep track of, for example, who was attending or not attending an event. To the second point, businesses across industries need new and existing workers to have these digital skills, but too few have been able to access. When we look at construction, transportation, and storage workers, 22% of workers in those industries don't have digital and haven't been able to access digital skills. For retail, wholesale, and auto repair workers, 14% lack these skills. In manufacturing, 16% of workers have no digital skills and 19 have limited digital skills, meaning more than a third of that workforce needs access to skills training. To dive down a little more into some of the examples of what this looks like in different industries. So in workers in the health and social work sector lack digital skills, which again, going back to the wide use of electronic health records in those occupations is really concerning as we think about how the telehealth services are really used as a strategy to respond to both the current health crisis and moving forward a transition for that industry. And this is a challenge for workers across industry as those jobs change, but it's also a challenge for workers in jobs whose occupations already require them to use computers. So among workers who need access to digital skills, 38% are routinely called on in order to use digital skills in their day-to-day work. So for example, some of this technology is things like being able to do their job. It's also things that are going to help people stay employed and be able to schedule or do the administrative side of their job. So for example, at one major casino, 50,000 of the company's 58,000 employees don't have a company issued email address. And instead they rely on this customized app in order to schedule and find out key work related information. So for the folks that aren't able to access the information through that digital app, they're not able to do their job, and they're also not able to access the kind of administrative strategies that are going to keep them employed. This is a particular challenge for small and mid-sized companies who employ the most people across our country. So a majority of workers with no digital skills are employed in small and mid-sized enterprises, and those with limited digital skills are overrepresented for these businesses too. So there are some bright spots from what we're seeing from businesses to engage and ensure that workers have digital skills. For example, Nationwide Insurance is investing $160 million in boosting digital skills. Guardian Life is launching a new effort to provide workers with advanced digital skills. Accenture has a broad-based inclusive future of work initiative to help workers whose jobs may be affected by automation. These examples are really centered on the larger companies that may have access to both the kind of resources and wide reach to be able to make those investments. And policy is going to be particularly critical for workers that are working with those small and mid-sized companies to help enable those companies to be able to provide the kind of supports for workers that are going to meet both their needs and workers' needs. And then finally, just to touch on the fact that there's a wealth of prior research about the wide-ranging effects of structural racism that hamper racially equitable outcomes, including in education and workforce development. And these effects spill over to the areas of access to digital technology and opportunities for skill building. So people of color are more likely to lack broadband internet access at home and lack a desktop or a laptop computer at home. And they also face greater difficulties in obtaining the technology often used to build digital skills. So it's probably not surprising that workers of color are overrepresented among workers with limited digital skills. Black workers are 12% of all workers, but 15% of those with no digital skills, and 21% of workers with limited skills. Latino workers are 14% of all workers, but a full 35% of those with no digital skills, and 20% of those with limited skills. It's also interesting to note that parents are overrepresented by workers of workers who have limited or no digital skills. They're 60% of total workers and 75% of those with no skills. So we see that across industries and populations of workers, this is a dire challenge that people are facing right now.
Thank you so much. So our next speaker is Amy Huffman, Policy Director, National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Happy Digital Inclusion Week, Amy.
Yes, happy Digital Inclusion Week. It's our 6th Digital Inclusion Week, and it's bigger than ever. So thank you, James and STEM Ed, for having me. And it's such an honor to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. I've long admired all of their work, so it's always really exciting to get to hang out with them and hear about all the great work they're doing. I learn something every single time. So I'm Amy Huffman. I'm the policy director for the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. We got started about 7 years ago to represent the folks on the ground doing the day in, day out digital inclusion work, making sure people have skills and computers and can have someone to help navigate them through all the different processes that you have to go to access the internet and get access to a low cost internet subscription. And we represent over 600 of those organizations and people across the country in 44 states. And we do a couple things to support them. So first, we advocate on their behalf. So we take what we hear from them about what they need and what's working, what's not, and advocate on their behalf to policymakers and then, other folks around the country. We also operate as kind of a peer-to-peer learning network. So we get these folks, these really smart folks that are doing this work on the ground together, and then we learn from each other. So they learn from each other, then we learn from them, and we take what we hear that works in these models, and then we support growing them and scaling them across the country. Then we work with great researchers such as Dr. Harrison and others to learn about to advance the research field and figure out where we need to go in terms to better understand the challenges that folks face in terms of digital inequity. And then we also just take that research and help our affiliates learn from it and grow and expand their services. So I want to step back just like really quickly and level set a little bit about what is digital inclusion? What is the digital divide? Why do we even care about this issue? So digital inequity is the disparity in access, knowledge, and ability to use digital tools and technology. It's particularly harmful for lower income individuals and minority communities. And then so digital inclusion then is how we get to our goal. Digital inclusion are the programs, the policies, and the tools that help us close these digital inequities and reach what we call digital equity. So our goal is digital equity, and digital equity is a society in which everyone has access to these things. So they have access to robust broadband service at an affordable rate that they can afford to subscribe to. They have access to the skills that Katie was just outlining so eloquently and the pathways to reach those skills, right? They don't just suddenly wake up one day and have these skills. They have people around them helping them get there, right? Organizations that help teach them the skills that matter and put them on these progressive pathways so that they can be employed and so that they can thrive in this new digital society. We want to make sure everyone has a computer in their home. I don't know about you, but I don't particularly like writing emails on my smartphone, much less a memo or, a paper. While we have a lot of folks across the country have smartphones, although it's a myth that everyone does, because not everyone does, we still don't have enough households that have actual computers in their homes. And so we need to work towards bridging that divide. And then finally, we really need more folks on the ground who are equipped to help navigate people through this really complicated process. We thankfully, and thank you to Congress for passing things like the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program during all of these COVID relief bills that came out in the past year. There's lots of wonderful programs that are happening now being funded by Congress and then also often state and local governments. But it can be complicated for a household to figure out how to navigate these things. So where do they go to find out who is participating in the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program? And then once they figure that out, they have to figure out how to upload their documents online when maybe they don't have a computer, internet, or the skills to do so. And then where do they go to find those skills? So what we've found throughout the pandemic is there's this real need for this human element to help close the digital divide. It's not just about the pipes and wires. It's not just about the buildings. It's about having people on the ground support these households across the country to get from point A to point B to point C and really get towards that digital equity goal that we have. And there's lots of ways to do that. Everyone's doing it differently. As you can see with our partnership with Microsoft and the state scorecard, states are getting involved in supporting these things in different ways, and local governments and every level of government and every part of society has a role to play in this, which I think is the exciting part. We all get to work together to close this divide. But there's lots of work to be done, lots of bills to be passed, including the infrastructure bill, which would really support closing the digital divide. And also in reconciliation, if things like the Device Act for Every American Act were included in that would go a long way towards bridging this divide. But we are on the path to closing it. I'm excited about that and excited about discussing these things with our panelists. So thank you, James.
Thank you. Our final panelist today is Dominique Harrison, Director of Technology Policy, the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Dominique?
Yes, thank you so much, James. Again, I'm really appreciative to be on this panel and excited to talk about some of the issues that our other panelists have been speaking about. I'm dropping a link and sharing with everybody because I really wanted to paint a picture for folks around what's going on and what we define as the Black Rural South at the Joint Center. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. So, as has been said, I'm the Director of Technology Policy at the Joint Center. And yesterday, we actually just released a report entitled Affordability and Availability, Expanding Broadband in the Black Rural South. And I really wanted just to highlight some things within the report that are going to address the question that James wanted me to respond to. So how does our nation stand to benefit from closing the digital equity gap? Well, when we think about a number of areas in the United States where people do not have access to broadband infrastructure or can't even afford such services, at the Joint Center, we really wanted to understand how this is impacting Black Americans in the rural South. And so to better understand the rural Black Belt, we looked at rural counties with populations that are 35% Black or higher. We collected this original data in order to isolate counties that were clearly part of the Black Rural South to understand the region's distinctive characteristics relative to other parts of the nation. African Americans account for just over 13% of the US population and 8% of the US rural population. And approximately 3.2 million people live in the Black Rural South, and African Americans collectively make up 49.2% of the region's population and narrowly edge out whites as the largest racial group. You know, lack of access to broadband is a problem both in metropolitan and rural areas, but efforts to close the digital divide often overlook the Black Rural South. Too often, national broadband conversations focus on rural America and conflate rural with white and point to racial disparities in broadband adoption as an affordability challenge facing Black residents of metropolitan areas. The discussion rarely gives attention to the unique plight of Black residents of rural communities. And for African Americans, lack of access to broadband is a problem in both metropolitan and rural areas. In the Black Rural South, 38% of African Americans lack home internet access. This is driven by both the lack of affordability. That means broadband is not affordable for folks who are low income, and availability of broadband services. That means that there is no broadband infrastructure, or they do not have the ability to access broadband at 25 down 3 upload megabytes per second. And we have used data actually from Microsoft and FCC to kind of understand this issue. So expanding broadband could help reduce the kind of deep racial and economic inequalities in education, jobs, and healthcare in the region. Schools in the Black Rural South faced a host of challenges, including teacher retention, an achievement gap, funding problems, and a lack of broadband that limit educational opportunities. Expanding home broadband access is one component in addressing these issues. Broadband access could advance education and workforce training. Online learning and remote training could open opportunities for students, workers, and teachers, just as Katie has shared with us today. Research suggests that students of color and students in rural communities are disproportionately affected by the digital divide. Black students throughout the entire rural South are among those least likely to have broadband. 36% of Black students in the rural South do not have access to broadband. So innovative systems and wireless internet connections can alleviate immediate inequality in access to broadband and facilitate online learning and remote training, especially as we think about living through this pandemic during another school year. Unemployment, labor participation, income, and child poverty rates are worse in the Black Rural South than in most other parts of the United States, and significant racial disparities also just persist. Greater broadband access and adoption in the Black Rural South could help increase earnings and reduce unemployment. And lastly, broadband access can help improve health. From 2010 to 2018, states with Black rural South counties experiencing some of the highest numbers of rural hospital closures. As hospitals close, telemedicine can connect rural patients to medical specialists and specialty care not available in their community, and also lower costs by diverting patients from more expensive care settings. Broadband connectivity is a social determinant of health in the Black rural South. So to sum this up, broadband access alone will not completely solve all challenges, but it is a critical component to starting to realize the opportunities to increase earnings, job growth, educational attainment, and healthcare in the Black rural South. So I hope that you'll check out a little bit more of our research at the Joint Center. But in answering that question, as I stated that James wanted me to respond to, it's important that we realize the kind of challenges that are occurring in specific communities across the United States and develop policies and programs that are intentional about creating solutions to provide folks with the resources and information they need to live happier, healthier, and successful lives. So thank you.
Thank you. So let me thank our panelists and get to some questions. So first off, anybody who's a participant here can put a question in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll happily look at those and appreciate a few questions from the group. Let me start things off by probing one of the challenges for government is, let me ask the panelists, how well organized is government at dealing with broadband? I mean, this is a new emerging issue. It didn't really exist 25 or 30 years ago. It probably didn't really exist as an area, even 15 years ago in thinking about this. So governments are trying to respond to this, federal agencies, state and local governments are trying to respond to this. Where do we see the difficulties in terms of how government is organized to deal with this? And is there anything we can learn from people who have done this well? Is there a state doing this well? Are there examples we can learn from, or do we need to identify those good examples of people addressing this issue right yet in government? So Porsha, can I first turn to you?
Jump in. I do think it's one of those challenges. Having spent time in a federal agency myself, I am sympathetic. You get your direction from Congress, you get your money, and it's sort of in this lane. But you're absolutely right. Broadband is one of those issues where there's so many facets of it. There's sort of like, how is it funded? Who are you working with to get that money? Some of it's at USDA, things are at the FCC. Then states have their own issues about siting and permitting and all kinds of things going on all the time. So I think that, that's one of those examples where sort of whole of government approach is really important. And as we just said, it's great to create that access, but just making sure the technology gets there, that's only the first step. Then you need to make sure that it's affordable, that people have devices to access it, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that where we've seen some success, and some of my colleagues on the call may have sort of some more state and local examples, but where different parts of government are coming together to think about all of those aspects, and especially to think about how is it playing out on the ground. I know the FCC is changing its approach, but for example, in the past, we've said, let's map where carriers say they're providing access. We're not saying who's actually accessing it, but where you could get access potentially. That's not really helping us solve the problem. So I think a key part of this is, as the research of folks like Dr. Harrison and the work of other groups that are on this call, and many participants who are in the field of, let's really find out what's happening for people on the ground so we can provide solutions that make sense for them.
I wanted to make one more comment also in line with what Porsha is saying. One of the recommendations that we have in the report is about increasing federal coordination on these issues. There are currently 57 federal broadband programs that span 14 federal agencies, with a number of dollars for broadband grants and loans for community stakeholders in addressing these issues. So there needs to be more coordination, frankly, right, to really understand and have the same kind of goals, right, to help solve this all together. And so I know that can only have so many implications for local and state leaders working on these kinds of issues across the US.
Anybody else want to jump in on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I would add that the federal government has been thinking about this since the advent of the internet. During the Clinton administration, there was, the NTIA was formed, and the National Telecommunications Information Administration. The term "the digital divide" was introduced by folks during that time, and the FCC has been funding, using the Universal Service Fund, has been funding broadband deployment and different programs for a while now. I think the lack of coordination has shown itself. In 2010, the FCC issued the federal government published the National Broadband Plan, which called for virtually universal deployment by this time. 10 years later, and we're not there yet, right? But I have seen an increase in coordination amongst the different agencies over the past few years, which is promising. The next step is increasing coordination between the federal government, state governments, and local governments, and making sure that all of these funds that are now available from the federal government, that there's when you get all the way down to the local communities, that they understand how to access those, and they understand how to use those to close the digital divide in their communities. Because we believe that the solutions are often local. It's the local communities that know their communities best and what they need. And so we need to make sure that we stack all these different policies and programs in a way that are seamless and that everyone can use them efficiently and effectively.
All right, so let me turn to another question that we got in the Q&A. It's around the role of educational institutions in contributing to this. So put yourselves in the position of a governor who's trying to think about, okay, where do I look at addressing this challenge, right? Is it something where I look to my educational institutions to be the primary vector of dealing with this? Is it coupled to schools and educational institutions strongly enough so that if I maybe teach digital skills, or I look at that as the vector? Or do I need to be thinking about this in the way that I look at ongoing professional development? In other words, it fits into sort of the workforce box, if you will, in government? Or is it something I need to build capacity separately to address? How would you get at that question of a state's now in the role of putting together a digital equity plan? What should they be stressing in terms of the capacities of state and local governments to address this challenge when they get these new federal dollars that we expect?
So I'll jump in. Prior to joining NDIA, I worked for the state of North Carolina's broadband office for 9 years. So I'll speak from that perspective. The answer is yes to all of the above, right? So this is not a issue that is contained to one industry. This is not just a K-12 issue. It's not just a workforce development issue. It's not a healthcare issue. It's an all of the above issue. And so what I have seen from my perspective is that there needs to be collaboration across the different state agencies, but there does need to be a coordinating body, and there does need to be an individual thinking about digital equity from the state perspective, which right now there's only 2 states that have a person dedicated to digital equity and digital inclusion. Okay. Most states do have a broadband office at this point, not every state, but most states do. And those are a natural place for this coordination and convening to happen. But those offices are oftentimes 1 or 2 people. They haven't historically had the support and funding they need. Now that's about to change with the hopeful passage of the infrastructure bill. But they need more support to do the work. And things like our state scorecard, we think, can help them do that. But yes, it's in all of the above. Everyone needs to be involved in this and coordinating, collaborating together.
Anybody else want to jump in on this question?
I can add to what Amy said and second the yes to all the above. I think it's important from the skills perspective when we're talking about access to that kind of training, to think back to the way that we've heard from our network about the 3 components of digital skills. So for foundational digital skills, we often see an adult education provider who is the primary training provider and system that right now under current funding is providing access to that training. However, given the disparity in both the access to skills and the need of business between and workers access, we can see that the current structure isn't enough. So we need more than just our adult education system to be providing those services. The second piece is that when we think about people's digital skills within the occupational context, what we're talking about is training for workers who are on the job and training for workers who are going to transition between industries because of the current crisis or any number of reasons. And so embedding within the way that we think about workforce, people's access to that skills training, that this is part of how people are going to progress throughout the workforce and throughout their career. It's really important to, yes, embed it within our educational systems, but also embed it within how we're providing support for business partners to be able to providing this training and this education to workers throughout their career, and in how we're thinking about our public workforce system as a support for workers who have lost their jobs.
Anyone else?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that, what Amy was saying around collaboration. I think there's a lot of opportunities for community colleges and universities, particularly HBCUs, to be working alongside local government and addressing these issues. HBCUs, particularly for their surrounding communities, have trust, at least for African Americans. They are trusted institutions, and much of the time they are conducting research or developing programs to address community needs. And so they can act as brain trust for local governments in developing kind of policy and programs to address some of these issues. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I mean, there's already funding by the NTIA for HBCUs and minority serving institutions to provide services. But I think there are also new kinds of partnerships that can be developed between local government and universities in trying to address these issues.
Anyone else? All right, so we have a question from one of the participants around the scorecard and how it relates to the Digital Equity Act. So can someone speak to, are we going to have more information as a result of all these new federal funds about what's going on? And can we drive this, to some degree informally by pointing out where we have gaps, right? How much of this is something where just pointing it out shines some light on the question versus getting to these things in some different way? Can someone speak to that?
Well, if I could start, I think the important thing, I'm super excited about the opportunity, hopefully with the Digital Equity Act to become law as part of the bipartisan infrastructure discussions. We know that's taken a little longer, I think, and we'll have to see what happens this fall. But, I think what's so important about that is the federal government also kind of puts money out there to the states, and then states do very different things with it. And so that's why the scorecard is important, is because often it's, states are busy, their offices are smaller, their budgets are more limited. They don't have the ability to sort of go to 20 other neighbors and say, how are you doing this? What's going on? What's a good way to do this? So the idea of the scorecard is to help states kind of get a snapshot of where they are, but also to be able to access other tools and treat it as an entry-level toolkit to looking at what other states are doing, linking quickly to some of their best practices. And it helps also, advocates and service providers out there in the field to say, well, how is my state doing? Oh, we're not doing great. What are there other things that I could bring to state policymakers as potential suggestions and potential levers? So I think, having been at the federal level of government before and seeing how this gets, these programs flow out, so often the need is for that kind of technical assistance and for bridging some knowledge gaps. So that's what we're trying to help with here.
Well, and right now, what is the balance between federal funding for addressing the digital divide and state and local funding? Can anyone speak to that?
I think by our silence, you can hear that that's a really good question that we might not have the answer to. I think in response to what I will just say is in response to COVID, a lot of the funding is coming out from the federal government. And some of it is flowing through states, some of it's flowing through local governments. And then also in response to COVID, we have seen states and local governments set up their own funds. And we've also seen philanthropy come to the table, corporations, people from, I mean, we're having conversations with folks I never thought we'd be having conversations with 2 years ago who are interested in closing the digital divide because they do see how much harm it has on our society. So I don't have a breakdown for you, but and I'm not sure if any of us do, but.
Well, and I think to Amy's point, so often, the feds just kind of send a big chunk of money, and then states have to prioritize, okay, how is this actually being dispersed within the state, where equity is a super important conversation there, and also, what are the areas of highest need and how we're going to apply it. And that's why I think the state advocacy conversation is super important.
Well, and sort of as a follow-up to this, how would you handicap the breakdown of effort here around how much of this is physical devices and infrastructure and broadband versus what I'd call training and reaching people to increase their digital skills? And is there a role? I mean, do we need more thought around things like micro credentials and giving people, the opportunity to identify their digital skills? I mean, it's some combination of those, but how would you weight those needs if you were looking at prioritizing those funds from the federal government to states?
I can start. I think that it is a continuous cycle that you can't say you need one or the other because each reinforces access to the other. So if someone doesn't have devices, they're not going to be able to access the kind of skills training programs that may help them be able to develop their digital skills. If they have access to a device but not internet, they're not going to be able to access the kind of training that would get them digital skills. And so it really is reinforcing that these are the three pieces that help enable someone to reach towards, as Amy put it, our goal of digital equity.
Anyone else?
I do think Katie makes a really good point, and especially during the pandemic, this was highlighted as more and more social services, education, workforce skilling moves online. A concern is, especially from an equity perspective, if people don't have that fundamental access, and it has to be broadband, affordable device, and the ability to use it, so many avenues of participation in life and society are cut off from them, that it's really important. And I think we have to continually invest in that flywheel, because we know, the cutting edge technology of today will be obsolete 5 years from now. So we need to keep investing in communities and figuring out how to expand access.
Well, and it seems to me it's a particularly difficult challenge to reach people who are not online, to get them online, right? I mean, that is really one of the ironic elements to this, is you need people knocking on doors, right? I mean, that's part of the, what I drew from your research, Dominique, about the rural Black South was, if you have somebody who's totally cut off, you can't use the internet to reach them, right? I mean, how much of this is a capacity challenge in terms of just having the resources to be able to go do that, right? I mean, that seems to me like that's a monumental challenge, somewhat akin to the census, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about deeply in terms of encouraging more folks to sign up for the emergency broadband benefit is that, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, wasn't given funding to actually advertise the program. That's important. People need to know that it's there and that it exists, and that there are, resources out there to help pay for broadband services. And so that's something that I know that they're grappling with, and that's been important to them in order to get more people online. So we need to be thinking more, again, intentionally about, getting the message out, working with community organizations who are on the ground, who are constantly in conversation with segments of the population, like low-income Americans, to provide that information, to let them know that the service is out there. And so I really hope that, I'm really happy, about the community organizations out there like that, like NDIA, who are working alongside community members to get more folks signed up. But as you said, if you don't have the resources in order to share that information, then the program won't be as successful as it could be. And that's going to be really harmful, I think, especially for students as we think about the school year and the fall coming up with the pandemic. It's a real thing that more people will unfortunately perhaps be sick. And so how are we going to deal with these folks that are relegated back home and still don't have the infrastructure and still don't have the services they need to access telemedicine, access education, and work from home?
So I'll just add one, to double down on Dr. Harrison's point is not only was the FCC not given funding to advertise the program, the folks on the ground who are the trusted resources in the communities, the librarians, the schools, the healthcare providers, the local nonprofits, neither were they. And they are the ones who these community members come to when they have questions. And so we really believe strongly that they need funding to advertise emergency broadband benefit and any follow-on program. And to your first question, James, I would just say there isn't, I think we need to invest in all of these things simultaneously and equally. However, historically, that's not been the case. So historically, most of the federal investments, state investments, and even local investments have gone to fixing the access problem of the broadband challenge, right? So have gone to extending access to areas where there's not access, and particularly in rural areas. And I'm not saying that's not a problem, because it absolutely 100% is, but historically there's not been funding to get computers to folks, to get skills to folks, to do the digital navigation. And the infrastructure bill would change that. Mm-hmm. Some of the response to the pandemic in the various bills that have passed are changing that, are in the process of changing that. But I just want to be very clear that we're not there yet in terms of making sure all of these things are being funded and being funded sustainably in a long-lasting way.
So on that point about, we're not there yet, how does the United States compare to the rest of the world on this question? Seems to me like we've got pockets of the United States that are doing really well and pockets that are poorly, but how do we stack up against the rest of the world?
Dr. Harrison, were you going to start? You were off mute. I didn't want to jump in if you were. No. So I can start on some of the skills piece. So first, when we're talking about active labor market policies and investment just broadly, not just digital skills, we invest less than every other industrialized country in helping people gain access to that level of skills training that people need in order to stay in the workforce and succeed in the workforce. On digital skills, we see the impact of this in outcomes. From every other industrialized country, we rank second from the last in people's access to that kind of digital skills and digital problem solving. And we can directly trace that back to both the kind of investments that we're making as a country and the policies that we have to support both businesses in providing those kind of training to workers and workers access directly to that skills training.
So can I ask a follow-up on that? So is that where we're last, is that in government investment? And that means that it's basically fallen on the private sector to do that? Or is that all, in, and even our businesses are investing less than around the world?
So that's in public investment, but it's also in public investment in things that make it easier for businesses to invest their private dollars. So unrelated just to the digital skills, there was a World Economic Forum report that found that right now the United States was, and this was pre-pandemic, was poised to cover with government and public investment about a quarter of the costs of technological change in the workplace. But just by supporting businesses' capacity within the same industry to work together, that same amount of investment could cover nearly half the cost of technological change in the workplace. So it's public investment, but it's also public investment in the kind of strategies that make it easier and more effective for businesses to invest in their private dollars.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I was listening to a news podcast, and I want to say that, in terms of this conversation around spending for infrastructure and reconciliation, one of the comments was that Biden's plan would have to be cut back, and one of the areas would be climate and education. And when you think about the amount of resources the United States have and the investments that we make in people and children in terms of education and providing resources, and then you look at the investment that other countries are making in regards to innovation and education for young people, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. The fact that we don't see it as an important investment and that we choose to cut back in those areas is an issue. And that's a challenge. And we will see the ramifications in our economic mobility, GDP, innovation, et cetera, and poverty and the wealth gap. So there are a lot of connections and nodules here as it relates to how this connects to broadband access. But I really think we need to, again, love the word intentional, need to be intentional about our spending and how we're choosing to really make the lives of Americans better. I haven't really dug into international data in a long time. I know a lot of countries, I call them lower income countries, are dealing with issues as it relates to build out of broadband infrastructure. A lot of people across the world, as well as Americans, get the internet from phones. But as we've spoken about today on the panel, that's not the way, it's not a way, the best way to apply for jobs, to look for government resources online, or to get education.
I will say, I think maybe we can learn something from some of the other innovations in other countries, just because, the United States has taken like a wire first approach to access, which is important. And, that there's a gold standard there, but it also takes a really long time to get to the last mile and to reach a lot of people in more rural and remote areas. Other countries don't have that luxury, but it does mean sometimes they're innovating and thinking about other kinds of technologies, wireless technologies, other options to figure out how to connect people. So I think, we should be humble and look around the world and see how we might learn from some of those opportunities and ideas.
Anybody else want to get in on that question? All right, great. Well, let me ask one final question of our panelists. So what is the biggest misconception about this issue amongst policymakers?
I can start. I think the biggest misconception among policymakers is that there's a policy out there to address the challenges we've been talking about today. There is no comprehensive policy that addresses the three pieces of the challenge of broadband devices and skills. There are proposals in Congress when you look at the Bipartisan Digital Equity Act that was passed by the Senate as part of the infrastructure bill that would start to address this by bringing together the partnerships that we've been talking about at the local level and the different capacities of states and local areas. But there is not a comprehensive policy that is addressed either measuring the needs of that help drive towards digital equity, including digital skills, or implementing a solution that can bring together those partners. And that's really where there's an opportunity for policy as we look towards the both passing the infrastructure bill and cementing the Digital Equity Act as a resource and policy instrument, but also moving, recognizing that is just a first step for how we're actually going to provide workers, communities, businesses in our economy with the kind of support that drives towards actual digital equity.
I want to follow on to Katie's comments. I think it's sort of a misconception. It's also sort of a way our systems have not kept up with the times. I mean, if you look at computer science education, until very recently, and thanks to the work of many of the folks on this call, most of the states around the country, you weren't getting credit for computer science classes. There weren't computer science classes available in school. And that's still the case in many, many districts around the country, especially minority and lower income districts. And I think policymakers maybe don't realize that we have failed to embed digital literacy as part of the basics of reading, writing, arithmetic. It needs to be in there with schools, with workforce readiness training, with adult education. It sort of needs to be embedded across the board. And I think they don't realize that hasn't really happened.
Amy?
Yeah, so definitely plus 1,000 to those things. We often see folks want a silver bullet for this issue, and there's just not one. It's complicated, and it requires action from all different sides. But what I would say is the biggest misconception I hear is that, if we just build it, people will come. It'll be fine. Just need to get everyone access, and everything will be all dandy. And that's just, or even if we give them put folks free access, that's all we need. We just solve those two things and we're good. And that's unfortunately not the case. We're seeing with emergency broadband benefit program, while we're super excited about it and think it's a wonderful program, that it's got a pretty low take rate. Most of us in the field thought all the funds would be expended by this point, and we're only at 6 million subscribers nationwide. And a big part of that isn't that it isn't solving the right problem, because it is, but it's people don't trust it. They think it's a scam, and they think, free internet, $50 off my monthly bill. What's this? And they just don't trust it. And then even if they do get to the point where they trust it, they find out it's temporary, and they're like, oh, well, I don't want to just get something to lose it, right? I don't know how long I'm going to have this, so I can't afford to keep it up after that. So there's this trust factor. So this issue is so nuanced. And the biggest misconception I see is that it's just one thing. We fix that one thing, we're good. We've closed the digital divide. We give everyone computers, we're good. And that's just not the case. It's all of it together, and it's very nuanced. And there's a lot of layers that we have to address.
So Dr. Harrison, I'd like to give you the last word.
Well, yeah, I just want to emphasize what my other panelists have stated and just said, there's just no one size fits all. There needs to be targeted solutions to address these issues for the community members on the ground. There was a question, I was participating in a panel around, why people not be signing up to learn digital literacy skills or such like that. But if you've got folks who are low income, who have two jobs, and they're just trying to get through the day, and they're taking care of their children and their families, they may not have the time to take a class to learn digital literacy skills. But if you develop a program that allowed them to earn while they learn, right, or allowed students to be able to take part in kind of workforce development programs that allowed them to get a salary but also learn new skills, then that would be a way to address the issue. But the point is, you have to know what the challenges are for those specific members of your community, and then be able to develop solutions that are very targeted and speak to the needs of those people. And so I'm hoping that with this influx of money that are going to state and local leaders, that people really look at the ways that they can address these problems for their people.
Thank you very much. Let me just thank all of the people who helped us organize this briefing, and I'll thank all of our fellow panelists. Thank you very much, and look forward to talking again on this soon.
Thank you.